Many of our citizens demanded an end to the outflow of capital from Russia. Now, these people's wish will come true. Do you remember how many of our citizens, angered by the freezing of some part of our foreign currency reserves in the West, heatedly demanded to take away all production facilities owned by Western investors, as well as to prohibit our companies from paying dividends to investors from unfriendly countries? It was perhaps a fair demand, but legally illegal and strategically wrong. Why legally illegal? Because the Bank of Russia's foreign exchange reserves have been frozen by European governments and the US government. And it was legally illegal to penalize private investors who had built their production facilities in our country or invested in the share capitals of various Russian companies. You don't have to. We just had to get them to keep working. Why strategically wrong? Because investors from other countries of the world would be given the wrong sign that Russia might do the same to them in case of some disagreement with their governments. And that Russia, while calling on everyone to respect international law, is itself violating it. And production facilities owned by investors from unfriendly countries that continue to operate were never taken away from Western investors, which was very much the right thing to do. Why? Because, as mentioned, they were not at fault for the actions of their governments, and many of them simply could not continue to work in Russia because of the sanctions imposed by the EU. But many conscientious investors tried to make sure that our country did not suffer economically, their production did not stop working, and our people did not lose their jobs. For this purpose, some Western companies, in order to circumvent sanctions, have transferred their production facilities to our enterprises in trust management. The other part sold their companies with the right to buy back. A third sold for good. But there was also a fourth part of those investors who simply left Russia. They have frozen their activities in order to undermine the economic stability of our country. Our governments have begun to impose temporary external management over such industries to keep them in operation. Well, to roughly penalize them for trying to damage our country and take production away from them for good, we needed to provide a legally sound justification. And it was done. On April 12, 2023, the State Duma passed in final reading a bill aimed at ensuring the security of the state. According to it, the court will be able to recover losses, including lost profits, as well as damages from an unscrupulous investor. Unscrupulous, i.e., investors hostile to Russia, will be subject to such a measure as the recovery of shares, property, and income in favor of the state. Such verdicts would be possible in a lawsuit brought by an organization of strategic importance. Actually, this would be an honest way to take away assets. The West has unreasonably and illegally frozen from us non-cash euros and securities, which it is trying, but is very afraid, to take away from us for good. And we will justifiably and legally take away from their investors the factories built from us. But that, as they say, is not all. 3 months passed, and on July 20, 2023, the State Duma passed an anti-sanctions law, which allows Russian beneficiaries, those persons under whose control the business of significant companies with a foreign ownership structure is actually located, to gain direct control over them. Already in September this year, the law came into force. It introduces the concept of economically significant organizations, and now Russian beneficiaries will be able to obtain shares and stakes through the court to obtain direct ownership, as well as receive dividends directly, bypassing foreign holding structures. In order to speed up the process of transferring foreign business assets to Russia, senators and deputies have proposed to regulate the procedure for Russians to take direct ownership of shares in companies key to our country. Such a law was adopted by the State Duma at the plenary session on December 14. Thus, we gave an excellent response to the illegal actions of Western countries that froze part of our foreign currency reserves and assets. Because now not only Western manufacturing investors who built their enterprises in Russia from scratch will suffer, then left our country and deprived themselves of profitable businesses and then left without property. But, much more importantly, financial investors who bought stakes, or even controlling stakes, in profitable Russian companies that existed and worked perfectly well before them will lose their income. You demanded that we stop the outflow of capital from Russia, so soon not only many industrial investors, but also most financial investors from unfriendly countries will not be able to receive profits and dividends, because they will lose their shares or stakes in our companies. This means that unfriendly countries will stop withdrawing decent sums of money that they have been siphoning from our country for years without investing anything in the enterprises they bought. A lot of people were attacking Nabiullina and shouting that the central bank could not prohibit the withdrawal of capital from Russia, not realizing that Nabiullina could not prohibit it. These, to put it mildly, nervous people did not realize that part of the capital being withdrawn from Russia consists of dividends and profits, which Western investors who built their enterprises or legally bought shares in our company, legally received and withdrew from Russia. It was not the Bank of Russia that should have banned capital withdrawal, but the deputies. And again, the deputies should not have banned the withdrawal of capital from Russia, but rather passed a law on the forced withdrawal of foreign investors' shares from unfriendly countries imposing sanctions against Russia, which they did. By the way, the president already seized some assets of foreign companies, such as Germany's Unipro and Finland's Fortum, by his decree back in April. But that was a point seizure, and the assets were seized on a temporary basis. The other day, by 2 other decrees, he stripped 2 more foreign companies, Austria's OMV and Germany's Wintershall, of their stakes in the companies developing the South Russian gas field and sections of the Urengoy oil and gas condensate field's Ochimov deposits. Their shares are now transferred to the joint stock companies Sogas and Gas Technologies. Again, these shares were not taken away from the partners, but were forcibly redeemed at market value, and the money was deposited in a C-type account, i.e. in rubles. In short, the president did the legally correct thing, not to take away the Germans and Austrians' shares, but to buy them out, depriving them of stable and high incomes for many years to come. In doing so, he made a positive contribution to the Russian budget and damaged the budgets of Austria and Germany. Let the Germans now fund one neighboring country at their expense, not ours. Especially since gas transit through that country has been greatly reduced, which means that the transit revenues of that country have been reduced, which means that the additional expenses of the Europeans for this anti-Russian project will increase. Returning to the law passed by the deputies, we note that stakes in Russian companies of strategic importance will be transferred to Russian beneficiaries permanently. The list of significant companies will be approved by the government with no possibility to challenge the inclusion. The Russian court will decide whether to exclude foreigners from the chain of ownership. In the law, this is called a restrictive exemption. The mechanism for restoring operational control will apply only to so-called economically significant organizations in which foreign structures from unfriendly jurisdictions or owners from such countries own at least 50%. Now we can only look forward to the first lawsuits and the first outraged outcries of our former partners who lost control of our companies, which we will accept with our usual satisfaction.